You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast, folks. Gale and Clavio joining you here. It is Thursday, November 7th, and a big week for Indiana football as they take on Michigan in what is a game that has a lot of implications for IU football coming up here over this weekend. Big game, marquee matchup on CBS Sports. You got Michigan coming into town. You got Indiana on the precipice of something truly, truly outstanding. And we're going to talk about all of that on today's show as we've got our friend Taylor Lehman back with us from Bison as we're going to do our now customary Thursday night / Friday morning breakdown of what to expect in the game. Taylor, good to have you back again. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I love being on the show, of course, and I always appreciate you having me on. But I don't necessarily have a Crimson Cast to listen to when I am on the on this show, so I could go back and listen to this show again, but I avoid doing that anymore. So.
I don't think there's any shame in being like, I was on that show, I am going to listen to that thing. That's totally fine as far as I'm concerned. But well, it's a couple of good shows that got recorded today. Of course, Crimson Cash out, and then Scott had a great interview with Jeremy Gray, which I'd recommend everybody listen to as well. So go back on the feed, check that out. But we're going to dive into the numbers here for IU football. We did this last week. It's funny, Taylor, we did that Michigan State preview. I had a bunch of people in the day and a half after that, between that and the start of the game, who were like, man, I was really worried, but I felt much better after listening to your podcast. And so hopefully we can make people feel better again with this one. This is a fascinating game. We're going to talk about it here in just a second. First of all, folks, just a reminder, we are here on the Back Home Network, brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and, of course, Indiana being a flagship school of Home Field, so much Home Field that you can purchase. They've been dropping some amazing stuff here recently. The 9 Windiana shirt was back. The Kurt Signetti shirts have been awesome. The pullover, the 90s era pullover has been awesome. We've had a little bit of everything from Home Field Apparel. So if you are an IU fan and you have not been to Home Field Apparel, there's still hope for you, but you need to get over there as quickly as possible. Go to homefieldapparel.com and follow them on social media. Sign up for alerts. You get some great text messages talking about what's available and what you should maybe think about purchasing. And of course, just the full gamut of hundreds of schools and thousands of different designs that you can choose from, including a ton IU football, IU basketball. It's all over the place. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use the code HOME23, HOME23, and get 15% off your first order. Let's also remind everybody that we're on Substack. Taylor's on Substack. Taylor, the sale's ending probably before people are going to actually hear this episode, but you've got a 30% off deal right now on Substack, right?
Yeah. 30% off on Substack. It ends at midnight on the 7th, going into the 8th. So like you're saying, Galen, unless they hear this, tonight, they might not be able to cash in, but it'll be the only mid-season sale for BSB. I felt it was a good time, and we're talking about the significance of this game coming up, but also, the postseason and obviously the Ohio State game as well. So a lot of people have become paid subscribers through that. So it's been really cool welcoming some more people into the BSB community.
And to be fair, even the normal rate of $50 to be a subscriber to BSB is a tremendous bargain. I mean, all the data that Taylor crunches, all the graphs, all the visualizations of what's going on with IU football as it compares to the rest of the conference and the country are absolutely worth your time and money. So head over to bitesizedbison.substack.com. And while you're there, you can find crimsoncast.substack.com. We'd love to have you as a part of our community as well. Over 1,000 people have subscribed for free to the distribution list for Crimson Cast. You get podcast notifications emailed right to your inbox. We also have a paid option which you can help us keep the lights on, help us providing you this great content that we try to provide on a weekly basis as far as IU football and IU basketball are concerned. So again, crimsoncast.substack.com. We'd love to have you in the community. All right, Taylor, we got a lot to talk about with this game, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So Indiana comes into this contest. They're 9-0. They take on a Michigan team that is not 9-0. Michigan 5-4 on the season. And this is one of those games I always love when, if you're a subscriber to Bite Size Bison, you'll know this, and some of you on the audience already are. I always wait for Taylor's like preliminary grid that he puts out, the worksheet, the advanced stat preview, I guess is what he technically calls it, that lays out, the Indiana's offense versus their opponent's defense, Indiana's defense versus their opponent's offense, individual stats for each of the categories. Last week I waited and then it popped for Indiana, Michigan State. And I was like, oh, this is a much more favorable matchup than I thought it was statistically. So I was really curious what the Michigan matchup would look like. And again, it's a much more favorable matchup in terms of like strength versus weakness and whatnot than what I would have anticipated. We're going to dive into all of these, but I guess as you put this together and it first formulated on the page, like what came to mind when you were trying to think of how to categorize or describe this particular matchup and what to potentially expect in the game?
Yeah, so I always knew that. Okay, so Galen, I've been looking at the numbers all season as I've been putting the data visualizations together, and I knew that Michigan's conversion rates weren't good. I knew that they were a rushing team. I knew that the advanced analytics did not really like Michigan much this year, which being 5-4 would suggest that as well. But the thing that I was actually surprised did not show up much, and there's not really anything necessarily dedicated to it, but I have a defensive line havoc chart that I fill out that I update every week in the recaps, and Michigan always does super well in that, and so I was surprised to see throughout the season. I was surprised to see how well they've been creating havoc with their defensive line, but how that's not really translating to wins necessarily. And then, putting together the chart, I was like, okay, where is this going to show? And it didn't really show anywhere.
Yeah.
They have like NFL, like several NFL guys on their defensive line, which I've outlined in the preview, and it doesn't really show in their defensive profile, at least the one that I put together. And I was kind of, trying to piece that together in my head. And I was like, how does that work? But I think teams are just able to scheme around it. And I think Indiana is even better suited than some of the opponents they played to scheme around it.
So a lot of people that listen to the podcast know this, but just so we're all on the same page, explain havoc to the uninitiated. So havoc is a measure of what the defense is able to do when they're racking up what?
Yeah, so it's a different measure for different places. I like to include any time the defensive line is disrupting a play. So a lot of places they just include sacks, tackles for losses, and they'll just leave it at that. But I also include like passes defended because they'll bat passes. The quarterback pressures is a big one that I like to include because if you're disrupting a quarterback's comfort, you're causing havoc. So mine's a little bit more. It has a little more breadth, I guess. And so, yeah, that's the idea of a havoc. A havoc instance is whenever there's some sort of disruption that is caused by the defense or that group.
So when you talk about this Michigan team, I mean, it's one of the things we've talked about, and you actually have a really nice chart in this week's game preview where you lay out the sheer amount of talent that Michigan has when you relate it to high school recruiting rankings and whatnot. And obviously that's not a like for like in terms of the actual talent, but it's a good overall metric. Michigan is basically tied with USC in terms of composite talent in the Big Ten. Ohio State's the clear leader. Oregon's behind them. Penn State is ahead of USC and Michigan barely. And then it's like Nebraska. Indiana's like close to the bottom. Only Rutgers and Illinois have less accrued talent. Northwestern has more than Indiana does, like Maryland does. So anyway, all of that to say, the hallmark of a lot of Michigan teams has been their ability to simply out-talent their opponents on both sides of the ball. And yet, whereas the last three vintages of Michigan teams have really been able to do that under Jim Harbaugh, the Sharon Moore Michigan team that we've got this year is really struggling across a number of metrics. And it's interesting because, like you said, like even though we have seen, I think a lot of this seems to manifest itself in Michigan being able to make plays early in drives or early in down sequences where they're making great stops on first down, but it appears to melt away as they get further into the drive chart, which leads them to kind of keeping their opponents from scoring a ton of points, but not keeping them from scoring the points or gaining the yards that they need to gain an advantageous position over Michigan. Would that be a good summation of things?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that probably is the biggest threat, honestly, just is Michigan's talent, because they do have a ton of talent. And so, when you're thinking about, plays on a micro level, that talent can be disruptive. So I think that the talent really is a threat, obviously. But the coaching really, and I wrote this in the preview as well, but the coaching really seems to be letting down the talent on the roster. When you have a lot of high talent, but you don't, I mean, I wouldn't even say it's just not a good conversion rate. It's like they have terrible conversion rates on both sides of the ball. And it just seems like a coaching issue.
Just to classify this, so conversion rate is ultimately when you talk about it, like it's the percent of first downs or scoring plays on either side. So how many are you gaining if you're an offensive team? How many are you allowing if you're a defensive team? So Michigan on the season, the conversion rate they're allowing on defense is 74.3%, which is 92nd in the country coming into this week of football. Their offensive conversion rate is 71.2%, which is 87th in the country. And just to compare, like what Indiana does on defense, the conversion rate they've allowed has been really impressive, 62.4% on defense. That's 13th in the country. And on offense, their conversion rate is 80.3%, which is 23rd in the country, which isn't quite as good as their defensive conversion rate stopped, but it's still pretty good. And it's really fascinating because, like you said, like Michigan is clearly more talented, but Indiana to this point has demonstrated like a much clearer game plan and much better preparation in games versus what Michigan has shown in basically the same time span.
Yeah, and I want to add real quick, conversion rates, the reason why I include them is because that shows how well a team can move the ball. And a lot of times, once they get down into the red zone, then they struggle with that. But I have a chart that also disaggregates all of those, so it shows how it ends, how their conversions, how their conversion rates are dispersed, and also when they don't convert, how do they end? But anyway, yes, you're right. I think a lot of it comes from just a lack of experience, and Sharon Moore, he had never been a head coach at any level before he took this job. And he reminded me a lot of Deshaun Foster, Galen, when we had talked about him before, how he was just very contained to UCLA. Sharon Moore, I mean, I think he worked a bit. He worked like a year or two at Louisville. He was at Central Michigan for a bit, but then got hired at Michigan and worked his way up there. And it just feels very similar to me. And so the offensive coordinator as well. I mean, he coached 2 years of FBS as in the FBS as an offensive coordinator at Old Dominion, and now he just happened to be the quarterback's coach for JJ McCarthy last year, and so he got promoted to OC. And it was just a big effort to retain whatever was left over from the Jim Harbaugh era at Michigan. And I don't think it's exactly working out for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like, if you look at Michigan's wins so far this season, we talked about this a bit on Bison Chat earlier on in the week. Like, they're 5 wins on the season. They beat Fresno State at home 30-10 in the opening game of the year at the Big House. And I mean, Fresno's only 5-4. That's not a team that's exactly let the world on fire in the Mountain West. They beat Arkansas State again. That's not a great team. They're 5-3 on the season. They beat Southern Cal or USC, not to offend any of my Southern California brethren, but they beat USC 27-24. And at the time, that looked like a really big win for Michigan. Now that USC is 4-5 and has lost on the road to Maryland, has lost on the road to Minnesota, it looks less impressive, certainly, than it did when Michigan did it originally. They beat Minnesota, but that, if you go back and remember that game, even though that looks better because Minnesota's 6-3, has played pretty well. They've won 4 in a row since that loss. The ending of that game was kind of controversial. There were some calls on the onside kick at the end of the game that didn't make a lot of sense. There was a couple of other things. And then Michigan also beat Michigan State, the team Indiana just beat. But whereas Indiana beat Michigan State 47-10, Michigan beat them 24-17. And even if you're going to take the rivalry game thing and put it in the mix, it's like you probably should be beating that Michigan State team at home by more than 7 points if you're a good football team. And so you look at the losses Michigan suffered. None of them are embarrassing per se. I mean, they lose at home to Texas 31-12. Texas is legitimately a top 10 team in the country. They lose at Washington, and that felt like a big win for Washington at the time. Mm-hmm. And it's progressively become less so. The real kind of red flag game, I think, was the 21-7 loss at Illinois. Because as we've learned, Illinois is not very good. Like they're kind of the classic, we're going to beat everybody worse than us and lose to everybody better than us type of team. And then, of course, this past weekend, they played Oregon, I would say, better than a lot of people, myself included, thought they would, but they still lost 38-17. Like that still was not a particularly close game. So you take all that into account, and then you look at the statistics that Michigan's racked up. It's almost surprising they've won as many games as they have. You could kind of argue that the Southern California and Minnesota games, there was some luck involved in the fact that they were able to win both of those games. They just haven't been that terribly impressive, and it hasn't been one particular area. Like a lot of times when a team like Michigan is bad or a team like Ohio State is like average, it's because there's a glaring weakness. And it's not like there's a glaring weakness on this Michigan team. As the kids say, Taylor, they're just kind of mid.
Yeah. No, they interesting stat that I found when I was kind of researching them was in their 5 wins, they've won by an average of 8 points.
Yeah,
like that they're not blowing anybody away, and they've lost 3 of their last 4 games, and just in that USC game, Galen, that I really feel like getting them that early in the season was really important as well, because they ran the ball a ton. I think they passed like 12 times, and then they ran for 290 yards. And then shortly after that, teams figured out, oh, hey, that's what Michigan's going to do. They're just going to run the ball. So if we force them into passing the ball, if we sell out on defending the run, then we can really neutralize that Michigan offense and have a good chance. So I expect Indiana to do something like that as well. But yeah, like you were saying, I thought they would be better this year. Really. Yeah. I remember in preseason, I was like, that could be a game that Indiana could win. That's like kind of a winnable game. That Michigan doesn't look too good going into the season, but I didn't know it was going to be like this.
I mean, and we obviously like our advanced stats here when we do our previews with Taylor, but there are some basic stats that you just kind of scratch your head about. This Michigan team in passing offense is 17th in the conference. And the only team that's worse than them in passing offense is Iowa, who happens to not be very good at offense, like historically. And I believe as a former Michigan quarterback in their midst. So, Michigan on the season, they've attempted 210 total passes. Now, compared to Indiana has not attempted that many, relatively speaking. Indiana's only attempted 250. But the difference is Michigan's 210 attempts has resulted in 134 yards a game. Indiana's 250 attempts has resulted in 284 yards a game. Michigan has 10 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. Indiana has 23 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Indiana averages 10.2 yards per attempt in passing. Michigan's averaging 5.8, which is the worst in the conference. It's worse than Iowa. It's worse than Northwestern. It's a passing offense that's just kind of dead in the water. And it's fascinating because, they've had some issues. They don't really have a quarterback. They've had 3 quarterbacks start games so far this season and play major minutes. One of them has retired from football, the erstwhile Jack Tuttle, who many of you are quite familiar with in Indiana land. But you go down their list, and it's like in the games they've won, it's in the USC game, they attempted 12 total passes and completed 7 of them for 32 yards. In the Minnesota game, they attempted 10 or 18. They completed 10 for 86 yards. And it's interesting because in the games they've had to pass in, Washington, Illinois, Ohio State, Oregon, They've attempted 25, 32, and 25 in those games, and they lost all 3 of them, and they weren't particularly impressive in any of those games. The Illinois game is one of only 2 games all season where they've cracked the 200-yard barrier in passing. So when you look at that, and you look at the Indiana defense, which has proven, they're not the best pass defense in the conference necessarily, but they've gotten so much better over the course of the last few weeks in terms of being able to be opportunistic in pass defense. You got to be licking your lips a little bit if you're Indiana, going in and knowing like this is not that hard of a pass offense to shut down, and it allows you to channel so much more of your coaching attention into stopping the run, which is really what Michigan likes to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. It's really interesting, Galen. There's a chart that I make that's like it measures EPA per target in the Big Ten and amongst wide receivers. And I was looking at it the other day, and I'm like, am I doing something wrong here? There's like no Michigan on here. And I looked at it, it's because like to keep it fair to the guys that are on there, I have a cutoff. You have to have so many targets to qualify to be on the chart, and they don't have a single receiver that has 30 targets this year. And I was like, wow, that is insane. And it's because they target their tight end all the time. Like
right.
Colston Loveland is probably maybe the second best tight end in Power 4 to Tyler Warren at Penn State probably. But it's really interesting, and really that, like I saw a Michigan fan tweet last week that they were like, we have to have something other than slant to Loveland. And I was like, oh god, that's not a good sign. So yeah, I think it's scheme. I think it's also their quarterbacks, I don't think are very high quality. I think their offensive line is a bit inconsistent. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think it is scheme. I think when you do have the talent that you have at Michigan, and I don't think their quarterbacks are terrible. But I will say, Davis Warren has played better in his last couple games. He hasn't thrown an interception in 2 games since he came back as a starter.
Big.
So
yeah. But now, you mentioned like Colston Loveland is clearly the bright spot in the receiving game. 49 catches, 523 yards, averages about 6 catches a game, 4 touchdowns on the season. Yes, 49 catches. The next closest guy is Samaj Morgan, who has 21. And the next closest guy from that has 12. There's 2 guys, Donovan Edwards and Tyler Morris, with 12. So it's just not a feature of the offense that's getting used very much. Now, running wise, Michigan, Kalel Mullings, 710 yards. Donovan Edwards has 467 yards. Alex Origi as a quarterback has 227 yards. But what's interesting is, like, as much as Michigan has had to rely on the run, they're not the best running team in the Big Ten. Like, if you're going to have that offensive performance in the passing game, you kind of have to be. But they are 8th in the conference in yards per game, 1,486 yards, 11 touchdowns. Indiana, on the ground by comparison's sake, has 1,727 yards and an insane 32 touchdowns. We need like an ESPN 30 for 30 just on Indiana's rushing attack and the amount that they've scored. But it's a stark contrast, given that Indiana does not lean like exclusively on their running game. The fact they've been able to scheme and play as well as they have, while Michigan, who has to lean on their running game, has not been able to, is really fascinating to think about, especially now that we've got a pretty large sample size to consider for the season.
Yeah, it is really interesting. The rushing attack is good. Mullings and Edwards are very, very good running backs. They're actually, it's interesting, Galen. We talk about the distribution of carries in Indiana's backfield, and it's kind of the same for Michigan between those 2 running backs. There are 20 Big Ten running backs that have 80 or more carries, and there are 2 from Indiana and 2 from Michigan. So the only 2 teams that have running backs with 80 plus carries. But yeah, no, I think Indiana's tackling is going to have to be very strong. They're tough guys. David Evers is a big guy. Mullings runs really strong. So they're going to attack. I mean, I think the entire offensive philosophy for Michigan is going to be attacking the interior of the defense. Whether that's passing to the tight ends, in the middle of the field, trying to get that open space behind the offensive line or defensive line into the second level, or just running right at them. So I think I think it's going to be crucial that Indiana they don't allow them to get a lot of yards after contact, because Mullings especially can, and Edwards is also a very talented runner. But yeah, it is really interesting. Galen, I covered Donovan Edwards recruiting quite a bit, because Ohio State was very much in on him back when I was covering Ohio State recruiting, and super super nice guy. I texted you actually earlier today. I'm like I actually really like Donovan Edwards as a person, but I keep waiting for him to kind of explode, but he just hasn't gotten the opportunity to at Michigan. The talent is there. He can work in the pass game. You just mentioned him as one of their leading receivers with 12 catches. And and he's their backup running back. And so, these two guys they're very talented. It just depends on how that offensive line can work against this Indiana defensive line, or this Indiana front in general. Because I don't know if the cornerbacks can be tested all that much for Indiana. So, the safeties, the linebackers, they're going to be able to cheat a little bit, and it'll be interesting to see how much progress Michigan can make it. And that might also be, what you were talking about earlier, Galen. I mean, if you're going to have a very interior centric offensive scheme, it needs to be really effective, like in the Big Ten, especially, because if you're not really able to get to the perimeter, the teams are, everybody talks about, packing the baseline in basketball. Teams can do the same thing in the box. So, I think that's partially why, Michigan wants to run the ball, but they're not super effective because they don't really put their guys in the best positions. So, yeah, I know I kind of covered a lot of different things there when we were just talking about the running backs, but yes, Mullings and Edwards. I do like those two. And so Indiana's going to have to be very fundamentally sound.
If you're looking for offensive bright spots for Michigan, it's like there's two things you can zero in on. One is their success rate in rushing, which is decent. It's 32nd in the country, 45.2%. The other is line yards in rushing. Like they do get a good push, and you'd expect that because they have a really talented and big offensive line. They don't do very well in pass protection, but they don't pass the ball that much, so it's not as big of a deal. And so I think, like, if you're looking at Michigan and you're trying to figure out, okay, how would Michigan win this game? What would be the scenario that would play out for Michigan to win this game, for Indiana to struggle? Like, if Michigan can keep the ball on the ground, if they can gain, as you've noted, like, they don't do a lot of chunk plays, they don't have a great explosive play rate. They do pretty well once they get the ball to midfield and beyond, but it's getting to that point. But if they can maintain success on the ground and get a consistent push against Indiana's defensive line, that's really their route. Like, they're going to have to chew clock. They're not going to be able to get into a track meet with Indiana. They're going to have to force turnovers, which they frankly have not been very good at so far this season. But they got to figure out a way to get the ball out of Indiana's hands. They got to do some things defensively, which we'll talk about in a second. But like offensively, they've got to run the ball, and they've got to kind of impose their will physically on Indiana, which feels like a thing that would normally happen because it has historically happened. But the way this Indiana defensive line is playing, the way they played, especially last week on the road at East Lansing, it's hard to envision a scenario where this particular Michigan offense is able to impose their will to the degree they will need to against Indiana to figure out a way to score enough points to come up away with a victory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I just have these visions of Indiana surrendering space to rushing attacks on the interior, from earlier in the season, whether it was Charlotte and I think Maryland, there was quite a bit of that too. They haven't as much in recent weeks since then, but that just kind of sticks with me. so part of me is like, maybe there is some sort of, maybe the door is ajar for Michigan to be able to do something like that. I don't necessarily have confidence in their coaching staff to scheme something like that against Indiana, but I just think Indiana has a huge advantage when it comes to just coaching. Like when you're talking about adversarial coaching, I think Indiana has the advantage. So I'm not super optimistic for Michigan to be able to do that. But there's room for it. And so yes, you're right. That's how they're going to try to win on offense.
Defensively, this is a tough game for Michigan because this Indiana offense is so good. I mean, I don't know that IU fans fully understand the playground that they're watching this Indiana offense play on. I mean, we're not talking about, and you had a great chart a couple of weeks ago or last week that illustrated like the top, or maybe it wasn't, I forget whose chart it was. I'm going to give you credit for it, but
Brian Freeman.
Yeah. The top offenses of the last 5 years of college football, and Indiana was like right up there among the very best. And it's like you kind of have to pick your poison. I mean, they're the most successful passing team in terms of EPA in the country. They're 19th in rush. They're great in early downs. Like they pick up first downs sooner than they should. They're amazing once they get to midfield. They get great field position, which is largely a product of special teams and defense. I mean, they just do so many things well. And Michigan, and this is probably the biggest surprise to me. Like I'm not shocked that Michigan's struggling on offense. Like that's always kind of in Michigan's DNA to some degree. Michigan normally doesn't struggle like this on defense. And, they're not terrible in any defensive category, but they're very, very average. They don't defend the pass terribly, but they don't defend it well. They don't defend the rush terribly, but they don't defend it well. And the one thing they tend to do is they do tend to force you to third downs, but then they're terrible at stopping you on third down. They're one of the worst teams in the country. They're 116th in the country in defensive third down success. So I say all that because if you look at Michigan's schedule, they, and who they've played, I guess the thing that sticks out to me the most is, they kind of got lucky that they faced Minnesota when they did, because Minnesota hadn't quite gotten their offense rolling. USC's offense has not been very good. Illinois has been kind of sort of there. The best offenses they've faced have been Texas. They allowed 31 points to Texas, and Oregon. They allowed 38 points to Oregon. They probably should get some credit for only allowing 31 and 38 points in those games. But I would argue Indiana's offense is as good as Oregon's at this point, and better than Texas's. And that does not bode well if you're Michigan, especially since you have to go to Memorial Stadium to play this offense.
And just like you were saying earlier, Galen, just the way that they're going to try to find success on offense is not going to be able to keep up with Indiana if they get rolling. So if Indiana gets up early, like they've done so frequently, I mean, we could be looking at, lights out for Michigan early in this game, because good luck passing. I don't know.
Well, that's the thing. Like Ben Wittenstein, like what he called in your column for Indiana to score like 30 points in the first half, and I'm like, Ben, come on, back. But I'm like, well, maybe. I mean, this is what's going to be fascinating to me. You and I were debating this a little bit early on in the week. Like, how does Indiana? Yeah, because you want to get up early if you're Indiana, and you want to put Michigan on their back foot, because when you look down the schedule, the most points that Michigan has scored against a Power 4 opponent all season is 27. And, Indiana, like, they find 27 points in the couch cushions, when they're fishing around for their keys in the morning. And if Indiana 4 touchdowns puts you beyond anything Michigan's been able to do offensively against a Power 4 school so far this season. So how does Indiana best attack this Michigan defense, who does have talent? And, it's like, how do you scheme so that you're doing it the most efficiently? Because the further you get Michigan behind in the count, the harder it's going to be for them to mount a legitimate challenge the rest of the game.
Yeah. And like you had said earlier, Michigan is really good early in offensive series when it comes to defense. So, we were talking about this before recording, which was like, how like you just asked, how do they attack the defense? And I think it's a great question. And the crazy thing is, this is where I've been so impressed, because the Indiana staff, they don't have one thing they go to. They're very multiple, like you've already said. Like they could run straight into the teeth of this defense, which is what they did against the Nebraska, and I was just floored. I was not expecting that, and they did it really effectively. And then I don't know if they're gonna be able to do that against this Michigan team. That the talent is just crazy on that defensive line, especially the interior. They have some great defensive tackles. I mean, they have two defensive ends on both sides that just they're just amazing. But it's and super productive too when it comes to quarterback pressures. It doesn't necessarily translate to sacks, which is interesting. But and that's the thing too. They they are probably the best, when it comes to applying pressure on the quarterback in the conference. And does Indiana want to risk that? Do they want to risk the pressure on Rourke, or do they want to risk not getting much in the running game on a first down play?
Right.
And so, obviously we're talking about risk and they're scheming against this defensive line, but I just, I think we're going to see a challenge that we haven't seen yet this season.
Yeah.
And so, that means like Drew Evans and Bray Lynch, those two are really going to have to show that, the what we've seen from them on tape and the grades that we're seeing from them from Pro Football Focus, are those accurate? Like, are you this good? And it's going to be really interesting to see. I'm going to be watching the interior of the Indiana offensive line, because I think that's a huge matchup here. But yeah, I don't know how they attack them on early downs, and it'll be interesting to watch.
My philosophy was, I think they're gonna use a lot of initial short passing into space to try to spread the Michigan defensive line out and not let them just zero in on Justice Ellison or Tyson Lawton. It seems like the logical spot to be. I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned like Michigan has a lot of talent in terms of the pass rush and the defensive line, and yet they're only 6th in the conference in sacks.
Yeah.
You know who's first in sacks in the conference?
Indiana
by a significant margin. Indiana has 6 more sacks than the second team in the every time I look at these numbers, I'm like, did someone like screw up the data set? Like, what happened?
Have you seen the tackles for loss, Galen? That's insane.
I have. Like, if the Indiana leads the conference in tackles for loss with 69 of them. The next closest team is Nebraska, who has 57. Ohio State's only got 56 tackles for loss. So just to give you some comparison, it makes no sense. But if you look at what Michigan has done against their opponents, it does feel like if you have a good game plan, you've got a couple of different ways that you can go about attacking. So if you look at, Michigan was really good against mid opponents in rushing. Like, Fresno State only gained 9 yards rushing, Arkansas State 58, USC 96, Minnesota rushed the ball 25 times and gained 38 yards. I don't know how the hell that's possible. That's wild. But if you look at it, like they let 143 yards on the ground up versus Texas, 114 at Washington, 187 at Illinois, 163 against Michigan State, 176 against Oregon. So even though they've got some physically imposing guys, this is clearly a defense you can scheme the run against and be successful, because all of the good offenses that Michigan has played against, with maybe the exception of Minnesota, who I still don't understand as a football program, have figured out a way to move the ball and gain somewhere around 4 to 5 yards a carry against this Michigan defense. If you go to the passing game, what's interesting is they've let up a lot of passing yards so far this season. They're the one game that they did a good job of not letting up passing yards was Illinois, but Illinois didn't need to pass the ball because they were running the ball so well. But the most recent, 2 of the most recent 4 games, they let Washington pass for 315 yards and a 70% completion percentage. They let Oregon pass for 294 yards and a 65% completion percentage. And so it to some degree, and even Michigan State, I mean, Aiden Childs, who got smothered in the crib against Indiana last week, passed for 74% completion percentage, only had 189 yards, but it was like you can clearly move the ball there as well. And so this is where, like, I struggle with this game, because I look at this statistically and I'm like, I don't know how Michigan competes just looking at the numbers they've racked up, looking at the advanced stats, yet my brain won't let me go there because of the helmets, because of just the aura of Michigan and the fact that, like, even when Indiana has had some statistically equal or superior teams, they haven't been able to execute. But man, everybody else has so far this season against Michigan. It doesn't feel like Indiana is going to necessarily be the exception here.
Yeah, it's I think I know I've already touched on this a couple times, but I just think that this Michigan team just highlights the importance for coaching in college football. There's a ton of talent on this roster, and there are playmakers on this roster. But if they're not put in the best positions to succeed, they're not going to. And so, yeah, like you were saying, Galen, like you see the talent, that there's NFL talent on this roster, and like you're saying with the helmets and like it's easy in my mind is doing this too. It's easy to you take statistics with a grain of salt and be like, okay, yeah, this Michigan team is struggling, and understand that they're gonna make some plays, which they will make some plays, but how badly they're struggling is really hard to get a grasp on. And yeah, it is really interesting. And I think yeah, I think what we're really going to see is Indiana really dominate in the trenches. And I think if they are dominating in the trenches, I think this can get really ugly. And I don't think Sig is going to take his foot off the gas at all. And this could be a game that's celebrated for a while by Indiana fans.
Yeah, and I get frightened when I hear that. I really do. Because, but it is worth noting, Michigan has only somehow, how the hell this happens, like in terms of scheduling, I'd love to get an answer. Michigan's only played 2 road games the entire season, and they lost both of them. They lost to Washington on the road. They lost to Illinois on the road. This is only their 3rd road game. But as you said, they've lost 3 of their last 4, and you just, like, even the Michigan State game, it was hard to take a tremendous amount of positives out of that game from Michigan, partially because of the fight at the end and just kind of the general screwball stuff that happens in that series. But it was also, Jack Tuttle retired right after that game. They still don't seem to have much of an identity. So, yeah, I think here's the thing. I'm always concerned about Indiana when they play brand name teams, because I've watched them lose those games so many times. And yet when I look at this game, what I see and what I feel, and how I have come to appreciate the way that this team and this coaching staff approaches games. This coaching staff and the players on the team relish taking opponents apart bit by bit. And it's that thing that we've talked about on the podcast where, like, Mike Kadick's talking about, well, we felt Washington's will breaking as we got further into the game. Or the joy on, from Justice Ellison when he's talking about, like, the Red Sea parting against Northwest or against Nebraska. Like, this team just loves slowly, taking an opponent apart bit by bit. And I'm sure they've looked at the film. I'm sure they're very respectful of the talent on this Michigan team, but they have to have looked at these numbers, and they have to look at what's going on in these games and been like, man, if we just execute and do what we do, we've got a real opportunity to win by a pretty significant margin in this game. And, as much as I've resisted that mentality, as I've looked at the numbers and tried to formulate my own thoughts on the game, that has become more and more to the forefront, which I guess worries me, because it's like, it almost feels like it's too good to be true in terms of the matchup, because everything Michigan struggles with, Indiana does really well.
Yeah. Yeah, Galen, I'm looking at the opponent adjusted EPA that Bud Davis releases out his EPA chart, and Michigan's down there with Maryland. They're on the same tier as Nebraska, right next to Illinois. And yeah, it's I think they're underneath UCLA, because UCLA's had a they've had a tough schedule, but it is really interesting to consider how poor this Michigan team could play in Bloomington.
Well, and one thing to note is, like, if you're looking for a matchup that might be a good harbinger of what goes on with this game, like, watch the left side of Indiana's defensive line, because they're going up against a right tackle in Evan Link, who's one of the poorest graded offensive linemen in college football this year. Like, he's really struggled. and he really struggles in pass blocking. Now, if Michigan doesn't pass the ball that much, that's one thing, but they may have to at some point. And it's kind of like what happened in the Michigan State game. You could see that kind of scenario playing out where if Michigan starts to fall behind and they have to pass the ball, you could see Mikhail Kamara, CJ West, James Carpenter, like that whole group just start to feast, because even outside of the right guard, that Michigan has got, all of their offensive line has just been kind of average, but their right tackle situation's real bad. And that's probably not something that they fixed in the week between the Oregon game and this game.
No, yeah. And I do think their offensive line, when when you think about the expectations with a Michigan offensive line, you think, okay, very good, because that's just the way it always is. But they are average to a little bit above average overall as a unit, which is better than Indiana has played in most games this season.
Right.
So that is important to note. But yeah, no, it's not what we're used to seeing from a Michigan offensive line, like you were saying. And yeah, if you're looking at that matchup on the right side of the line, I think that'll be a lot of Linnell Carr on that side. So that will be interesting to see. But I think that Mikhail Kamara is playing out of his mind right now, and I think he's that's somebody to watch on Indiana's defensive side for sure, especially in passing situations.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean that, and then on the flip side, like, can Michigan bother the Indiana offensive line, who has played so well this season? That's been probably maybe the biggest revelation on the whole team. But as you mentioned in your piece, Michigan's D-line is really talented and statistically racks up really well against the best teams in the conference, including Indiana, in terms of quarterback pressures and sacks and all of the things that you would normally see generated by a good defensive line. So those are the things to watch. Like, a lot of this game, as normal with Michigan, is going to be one in the trenches, and how well can Indiana utilize all of the levers that they have on offense to take some of that pressure off, to back the defense up a little bit, make them play deeper, and not be so keyed in on trying to get into the backfield and tackle Curtis Rourke and disrupt the passing game. It's going to be a fascinating thing to watch, and I'm really curious to see how Mike Shanahan decides to attack this from a play calling perspective. And this is, you've talked about many times Shanahan just like being in his bag, drive after drive this season. It's been a great thing for IU. This is probably, as you said, is going to be the biggest test, just in terms of the numbers and what the particular parts of Michigan's defense have done. But then again, we said that about Nebraska too, and that ended up being the biggest mismatch of the whole year, one could argue. So who knows? I cannot wait to watch this play out. I'm very curious to see how Indiana ends up tackling it, and it should be a really fascinating one.
The thing I appreciate about Mike Shanahan's play calling is that he seems to have a deep well of plays for every situation, and he knows how they work together. He just knows his own playbook really intimately, which is kind of a low standard for an offensive coordinator. But from what Indiana has seen, just like how, like, Rod Carey showed a little bit of it towards the end of last season. How can you make plays build off of each other? And just with all the misdirection and the RPOs and the screen game, and how and some of the pre-snap motions that they have, and then also Curtis Rourke and his familiarity with it, and his, I don't know how he learned it so quickly, but how well he knows the playbook is super impressive to me. Just like, I tweeted this last week. I said that Mike Shanahan must be the best red zone schemer in the country right now. This, just some of his red zone plays are just insane. Miles Price, he always cashes in on some sort of like insane schemed play. It's an RPO screen to the sideline. Curtis Rourke is throwing off his like throwing shoulder somehow, and Miles Price is right there wide open, or some sort of mesh concept, and
Yep.
Miles Price is always wide open in the red zone. I don't understand.
It's wild. It really is. It's something new. And I'll say, like, I was pleasantly surprised that they mixed two receiver like end arounds into the last game. It's like, where's that been? And yet, one of them went for a touchdown. The other one almost went for a touchdown. They just keep throwing new wrinkles in. I think I forget who I heard talk about that. It was one of the national commentators. It might have been Mike Golick Jr., who was like, this team keeps adding things.
Yeah.
Like it's not like they're running like advanced versions of the same stuff they were running in week 4. Like they're just like, yeah, no, let's throw these wrinkles in that no one's seen. And one can only wonder what they've got in the bag waiting to be uncorked in this one. It makes IU offense appointment television. And I hope all of you are keeping those appointments because they're good appointments.
It is really cool seeing like national pundits talk about Indiana's offense. Like I see some people tweet videos when I follow a lot of people who study football scheme. And so I'll see them post videos of Indiana's offense. I'm like, what? And then Mike Golick Jr. like talking about Zach Horton and Carter Smith. And I'm like, what is happening here? This is crazy. But yeah, their offense is so it's just so complex, but it must not be that complex to learn. If Curtis Rourke came in and all these transfers came in, they just must be really effective at teaching and organizing and communicating. And Curtis Rourke, obviously he's a dude, but that I'm very curious how that works exactly, because they just keep adding things. And I actually, Galen, I don't want to hold you too much longer, but
I'm the one that invited you on the podcast. What you want, Taylor?
Yeah, the Colorado's offensive coordinator, I think Pat Shermer, he was talking in an availability earlier this week, and he was asked a question about refinement versus I can't remember. Like innovation or whatever.
Right.
You basically, how much are you trying to fine tune your offense versus how much are you developing and innovating still? And he said you're doing a little bit of both. And I was like, okay, well, that really seems to check out with Mike Shanahan. And with the way that things are running now, I'm not sure how much fine tuning they're actually doing. So they have room where they can add a bunch of things. So, I just find offensive play calling super interesting. So Mike Shanahan it's been a treat to be able to watch him. Every single player he's called.
He has. And I mean, the one thing I'll add to that before we wrap up is, I mean, the offensive play calling has been amazing, but what makes it work is the players' willingness, not just to execute the plays, but to do the extra stuff. And again, I think it was that Mike Golick Jr. Video that came out earlier this week. And like, he went out of his way to highlight how, the play that Miles Price, the end around with Miles Price that almost scored a touchdown. It was Zach Horton going out and like selling out on the block, but it was also, I think, Trey Wedig going down and like blocking at 3 different levels and like springing Price on 2 separate occasions. And it is that level of buy-in from the people that are doing the blocking, including other receivers on these plays, that allows Mike Shanahan to do all the things that he does. I mean, look, we were both around for the Kevin Wilson era. Like, we've seen like smart play calling, but if you don't have guys that are bought in to the degree that this Indiana team has demonstrated that they're bought in so far this season, it doesn't work nearly as well. A 35-yard gain becomes an 8-yard gain because you don't have that block that springs the guy for the extra yardage at the end. And that, to me, it's like, the play calling again has been great. I'm not trying to take away from that, but without that execution by the players, it doesn't look nearly as great, and you don't get the statistical benefits that you've gotten, without that extra effort.
Yeah, and just the depth too. I mean, Keyshawn Williams leading the wide receiving core last week was a surprise to me. So, just being able to turn to these guys, I'm not really even sure how that's decided. I don't know how it's like, we're gonna keep going to Keyshawn. It just happened. I don't really know.
I think a lot of it, at least from having watched as many of the games that I have, a lot of it is just, okay, who's the defense deciding that they're willing to leave alone?
Yeah,
and that's where you end up going. It's wild to think about, because it's and we've seen, it's like last week Elijah Surratt gets back onto things after that 1-catch game against Washington. He has 4 catches, 59 yards, 2 touchdowns. And you're like, oh, okay, great. But you look at Omar Cooper. Omar Cooper He's had one catch the last 3 games, but it's been a 36-yarder, a 42-yarder, and a 21-yarder. He's almost become like, well, let's wait until they forget about him on one play, and then let's make sure to take advantage of the fact that they've forgotten about him. Meanwhile, it's like Miles Price has been probably the most consistent receiver. He's got 28 catches on the season. He has no game where he's caught more than 4 balls in a single game. Miles Cross, who's almost like the forgotten Miles on this team, he's been feast or famine. He had 7 catches against Nebraska. He had 1 catch the last 2 weeks combined, didn't catch a thing in the Michigan State game. So it really does feel like, whose turn is it to step up? And a lot of it comes down to, well, the opposition is just not paying attention. And again, it's like Keyshawn Williams didn't catch a ball in the Florida International game, had 6 catches for 85 yards against Michigan State. So I'm both impressed by the coaching staff and their willingness to like bring people in and be like, all right, we'll take what you're giving us and we'll still gain enough yards to score. But I'm also terribly impressed with the willingness of this remaining group of receivers, since we've, as you know, lost a couple since the start of the season. Yeah. This group's willingness individually to say, it's not my day to catch balls. I'm going to go do other things, and I'm going to contribute to the team's success. And my day might come later. And in almost every single case, it has come later. Like no one's really been left behind in the process.
I want to add one more thing, Galen. In a place where I think the playbook might expand is with the slot receivers, with Keyshawn Williams and Miles Price, which it might have already done that against Michigan State. That's why my Keyshawn Williams saw so many targets. But Miles Price is, I can't remember if it's 5th on the team in targets or 5th on the team in routes run. I can't remember which one it is, but either way, he is, not seeing the most opportunity, but he adds the 2nd most win probability per target on the team. So, a major heat check type of guy, but at the same time, at JMU, this staff just really prioritized their slot receivers. They would catch, more than 1,000 yards receiving. And I just think that there's more to be discovered, more to be shown when it comes to scheming the slot receivers. I think in the last stretch of this season, since they're playing Michigan, they're playing Ohio State, and whatever the postseason brings, I think we're going to see a lot more creative scheming with the slot receivers, which we've already seen a little bit of with Miles Price, like I was just talking about a little bit ago. But I think there's more there, and I think that's something, especially some explosive plays like downfield. I think there's more that they haven't uncorked yet, like you were saying.
One last note statistically. So when we first started looking at this game a few weeks ago, Indiana was about a 78 to 80% favorite on FPI. They are an 86.8% favorite in this game, according to FPI. And the one thing that's fascinating, and we've talked about this, like the hereditary nature of college football and how much is placed on prior success from previous seasons, and that feeds into brand name. S&P Plus has Michigan, I think, at 30th in the country. At least they did coming into the week. Yeah. And they're 46th in FPI. So, it's one of those games, again, where you've got like a pretty big delta between Indiana and the team that they're playing. What's exciting, I guess, is like if Indiana wins this game by a sizable margin, this is a good strength of schedule victory for Indiana. It's a top half team. They're about the same as Washington when you look at their rankings. Like Indiana could really, if they play the way that they need to in this game, they could really do themselves a whole lot of favors when that next college football playoff poll comes out next week.
Yeah. That's one thing that's, we understand that a lot of even some of the statistical models, they'll favor the brands, the historical winners, and obviously humans subjectively will as well, like the committee. And there are obviously some major drawbacks to that, which Indiana fans have felt. But there are also some really great upsides as well. Like you were just saying, that if you beat a bad Michigan team, you're still beating Michigan, and you're still beating them by as much as you beat them by. So, obviously, like you were saying, Galen, this whole conversation is very uncomfortable. but when you're talking about like style points, it is crucial, and that is something that I thought of when they kept racking up the points against Michigan State. It's like you got to keep the starters out there because you have to make statements every single week as Indiana.
Right.
And so, this could be another one. Obviously, you have to win, but how much do you win by? That becomes a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's not style points; it's preservation points.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's real. It's
Yeah.
that. It's how you think about it. Like, I mean, it's why Indiana kept scoring against Michigan State. They had to,
Yep.
because we've seen that Indiana's not going to get respect unless they win these games by large margins, which is what makes this game even more fascinating, I think, in terms of like, what can Indiana do? Because, as much as we've laid out the frailties of Michigan over the course of this season, I mean, the reality is they haven't given up more than 38 points all season, and Indiana regularly scores over 38 points. Like, what does Indiana do? That 38 points was an outlier. I mean, the other games they've given up 31, 27, 21, 24, 24. I mean, this is a team that does a good job of keeping you under wraps a bit. So it will be a really fascinating test when you get beyond the wins and losses thing, even though that itself will be a test. But like, exactly how much muscle can Indiana flex in this kind of a game? So,
well, you see that stat that was like Indiana's won by an average margin of 32 points, which is more than 101 teams average in a game.
It's almost like, again, it's one of those stats where I'm like, I'm sure this is an accurate stat, but I can't take myself seriously and read that and think that that's accurate. It boggles the mind. I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, well, Taylor, this was fun as always and informative, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And folks, if you like this type of statistical analysis, like to dig into the numbers like this, be sure to head over to Bite Size Bison, throw a subscription down. You will not regret it if you're an IU football fan or just a college football fan in general. So Taylor, thanks again. We will not have you on next week for the preview because it's a bye week, but we will absolutely be having you on as we get ready for the Ohio State game in a couple of weeks, regardless of what happens this weekend. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And thanks to all you folks for listening, and we wish you the best of luck as you hopefully voyage down to Bloomington to watch Indiana versus Michigan, or at the very least, figure out where you're going to watch the game at home or at a bar locally. Our thanks to Home Field Apparel, our presenting sponsor. Our thanks to Taylor Lehman from Bite Size Bison, and our thanks to all of you folks out there in the audience. I'm Galen Clavio. Thank you for listening to Crimson Cast. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody. And goodbye, YouTube.